Now we will kick off with a Grow panel, during which you will meet operations professionals at different stages in their ops careers, and who will share about their challenges and opportunities that they faced in their journeys. And hopefully they'll provide advice to those of you who are navigating your own. The panel will be moderated by our very own Charlene Chen.
Wonderful. So I have the pleasure of moderating this amazing set of panelists, who I will briefly introduce, but then we'll get to know them a lot better with the first question of this panel. So first off, I would like to introduce you to Brooks Bush, who is the CEO of Elate. And don't be fooled, CEOs can definitely be ops leaders in their previous lives. He was former VP of Ops at Springbok. Also like to introduce you Marta Kut, who is Principal of Business Operations at Catalog. And I'd also like to introduce you to Mike Strange, who is the Director of Operations at Just Eat for Business. And last but certainly not least, Kelsey Char, who is the COO of Marvel App, and also along with Ben Gately, who you met earlier in the day, founder of COO Stories. So to kick it off, and I will tell you which order to go into, I'd love to hear what has been your career path thus far? And did you know that operations was something you wanted to pursue, or did you accidentally fall into it like me? Why don't we kick it off with Brooks?
Sure, thanks, Charlene. Excited to be here today. And I think to your point exactly, a lot of the background and journey that I've had in my career before CEO role has helped inform and kind of shape my overall trajectory. So my first role out of school was at a high growth software company here out of Indianapolis, where we're headquartered. Started there on an account coordinator on the operations team for our channel sales department. And I think early on, when you get exposed to operations, you realize just how much visibility across all areas of the business you have. And that was kind of one of the first inklings that I had, where strategy and operations was going to be something that I wanted to continue to pursue. Spent pretty much the entirety of my career in high growth software companies. Went through a few different opportunities on the sales side of the house as well. But as you mentioned, Charlene, prior to launching Elate, had been VP of operations at a startup called Springbok. Joined there as one of the founding team members, the fifth employee to really build out and lead sales, marketing, and ops. What the role looked like was sitting directly alongside our visionary CEO, setting that 3, 5, 10-year plan for the company, figuring out how do we get there? How do we go about it? Annual strategic planning? How do we go about quarterly goal setting? How do we just remove friction and barriers throughout the business as we continue to scale? And in large part, kind of that experience in and of itself led to us starting Elate about 2 years ago. Elate's a strategic planning platform for strategy and operations leaders. So very much the tone of our business, even the role that I'm in now, leads into that strategy and operations side.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brooks. Over to Kelsey.
Hey, everyone. So I didn't know that I wanted to work in operations, right out of school. But similarly to Brooks, I was an account manager at my first tech company. And it was there that I kind of completely fell in love with tech and decided that I wanted to pursue operations. So I started out doing management consulting at PwC, and I did that for 3 years. But it always it never felt like the place where I wanted to spend my entire career. In some ways, I found consulting to be at times a little bit fluffy. And when I left to join a tech company in Berlin, which is where I was the account manager, I just found it so much more tangible, and it felt a lot more exciting. And I knew from that point onwards that I wanted to work in operations.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kelsey. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't think I knew that I always wanted to be in operations either, which is definitely a theme that's running through this. I knew that I wanted to be in tech. It was something I was really excited about. And so my first job out of school was launching an app for a bus company. And I think it was during that experience that I realized that I loved being a generalist rather than a specialist. I think as I kind of learned a bit more about what that meant, I learned that operations was a brilliant field for being able to dabble in a lot of different things, which I really enjoy. So I started to do that for a couple years, joined the startup that was City Pantry, and then realized I liked working on delivery, optimizing different things, taking on different projects, culture, customer service. And so it was kind of very much an organic growth. I realized what I was doing was operations, because I liked being quite broad and optimizing. So yeah, didn't really know at the beginning, but definitely learned to love it organically as time grew.
Great, thanks, Mike. And over to you, Marta.
Hey, it's very impressive to hear what everyone's been up to. And I think in comparison, I'm at the very early stage of my operations career compared to all of you. So like I kept thinking like when is it when I like what is my operations career or when did it start? And I kept thinking like back at university, I was running a badminton club, which meant organizing. So like running the whole thing, being responsible for everyone. And I think I already had like sparks then, but I didn't know it at the time. And after finishing university, I applied for a role at TransferWise, which was like an operations assistant, which was basically I helped to do an office move. And then that's how I got into tech. I never knew that I wanted to be in tech companies or startups. So it just kind of fell into my lap in that sense. And as the company was growing very fast, I kept taking on more and more roles and more responsibility. And without realizing, I was doing the, let's say, team calls and organizing different things. So it just kind of happened like that. And when White was growing quite big, then I was looking for another role. And then there was an operations role. And then in the beginning, I wouldn't have thought that I could have even applied for these things. But I had a great friend who kept suggesting that I definitely should. And that's how I got into catalog. And for now, for 2 years, have been learning how companies work even in much more detail. And it's been great. And I definitely love it. But I'm also on the same boat. Never knew that this could be for me, but I'm very happy that I found it.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your lovely introductions. And so if you're in the audience listening and you're not sure exactly how you fell into operations or how you're going to get into it, have no fear. It happens quite organically. So to continue the conversation, and this, from the panel that we had earlier today about discovering different specialties, I think it's one of the confusing things we have as operations professionals is just defining it. So, and you don't have to all speak, but I just love, maybe we could start with Kelsey. Just like, how do you define operations as a bucket? What are some of the things that you include in that in terms of functions or tactics or tasks? And then anyone else can chime in.
Yeah, such a big, important question. And I think this comes up a lot because operations does mean different things in different businesses. It commonly, in my understanding of operations, it commonly covers like internal ops. So things like finance, people and HR, legal and compliance, like office culture, that kind of thing, keeping the kind of wheels on the bus turning. And then it can also, and it does in my role, cover kind of business delivery ops. So what needs to happen in your company, either manually or kind of assisted by automation, to deliver your product to your customer. So in that sense, I think of it as operations as delivery of the business. And so like in my previous role, it was quite a operationally intense product, and we had quite a large operations team assisting customers and troubleshooting and things like that. But in my current role, it's I work at a SaaS company, so operations there looks a bit different, and it's more about like our trial activation process, or I don't know, like our customer support processes to try and assist customers to help themselves. So I think because every company is different, operations looks very different at each company, but those are some of the things that I would define as operations.
Great, thanks, Kelsey. Brooks, do you want to add anything? Since you've done operations and now you've become a CEO.
Yeah, I think to Kelsey's point, a lot of operations very much entails kind of the inner workings of the business itself. How are we continuing to think about growth? How are we scaling? The way that I try to condense it, I think, for the internal side is how do we remove friction? So as naturally we continue to progress, continue to add new areas, new platforms, new feature sets, it is how are we removing friction in that process to allow the individuals that are taking on that and carrying it through to be as effective in their role as they possibly can. I think that's one element. I think the other side of it, and this is probably more informed by like earlier stage companies with operations, it is, and this is probably the aspect of it I fell in love with, is the aspect of building from 0 to 1 or starting from scratch. I think operations at a more established company is really about removing friction, not just adding process for the sake of process. But at earlier stage companies, I think often strategy and ops folks are the ones who get tasked with, hey, we need to go do this. Well, Brooks, Kelsey, Mike, Marta, why don't you go figure that out and get it to a point where we're able to determine whether this is going to be something that's successful for us or not. And then once you've built it, then we can hand it off to someone to take it and run with it, right? If we want to build out a channel program, why don't you test that for us? If it works, then we can bring in someone that's probably more specialized and an expert in that given area. And we'll shift you into that next thing that needs to go from 0 to 1 within the business. So I think those are the two, I think, high level structures that I often will categorize strategy and operations as.
Great, thanks for adding that on. Yeah, I personally have found it really difficult to like describe what operations is, and for anyone else in the audience or on the panel who got an MBA, you know, like basically operations is like supply chain management, and it's all about like moving goods through, you know, a value chain. So I only became exposed to startup operations later in my career, and you know, found it very confusing to say like, well, you're basically just this giant problem solver. So whatever problem needs to be solved at whatever stage of your startup, it seems like that's what you do. And then maybe you specialize as you go, as the company grows, and perhaps you define your specialization, unless you become a COO, who I had many great conversations with Kelsey about, you know, how that can just encompass everything under the sun. But great, now I'd love to hear, maybe Mike, if you could take this question. What are some of the skills that you feel like you've developed in your ops career? And, you know, if you could talk about either technical skills or soft skills, like what are some of the skills that you think have been most helpful for you to develop and hone as you've progressed in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big question. I think, what are some of the skills I've developed? I think one of the things that I learned really early on is to listen well and be really hungry, and just don't assume that something is being done. I think it's quite often quite easy to like assume that someone else is on something, or assume that that problem is being dealt with. And I think that one of the things that I learned quite early on is to what we call in our business being hungry. And that can mean asking questions, being really curious, listening actively to what those answers are. I think that's something that I just learned is so important. And then what that translates to is really getting stuck in quite a lot as well. I think something that I learned, which is related to that, is I think when I first went into operations, I thought it was really kind of really processy and automated and technology based. And then I think I quickly learned it's so people orientated, because you might make a process, but it's often people that are executing on that process. And so ensuring that you have the buy-in from those people, ensuring that you're making processes for those people. So people skills, it's so translatable, it's so transferable. I think, yeah, was something that I had to learn quite early on, and surprised me, I guess, a bit about the role that I thought I was going into. But it's one that I've loved to develop. But yeah, be hungry, ask lots of questions, and make sure to listen actively.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I've just seen Kelsey. Yeah, it's so ironic or perfect that you use the word "be hungry," considering you run operations at Just Eat. Wonderful. And Marta, would you like to add anything as someone who humbly shared, but you definitely made your way in your ops career? What have you found as important skills or things you either figured out along the way or had to develop as you took on your new roles?
I would add to what Mike also said is like being flexible, because you can make up a process based on what seems to make sense. But if it doesn't make sense for people, you just have to course correct and change whatever you were doing, because like people are our customers. That's how I've seen, like in the company. So like when I was also working in the office team, they're like the whole company is my customers. How can I make them work their best? And I would also I think one of the skills I've learned is like looking at the bigger picture. So like you can make like you can as an ops person, in an early stage, like what are all the small things that we need to have, and like what Brooks was saying, like building those foundations. You may not have them in the beginning, but it's like building that and then building on top of that. I think is it's been very interesting process, because it will change again as time goes on. And you have to be reliable. I think that's the other main thing. Gotta get stuff done.
Yes, we debated whether we would say swear words, but most people agree that ops people are really good at getting shit done. So I think that's a very quick and dirty way to describe ops people. Well, I want to pick up on something that Marta shared. I like that word of foundation. So operations is often, building the infrastructure for an organization as it scales from early stage to, maybe growth stage and then matures. Hopefully, if your startup makes it to that stage. But bringing it back to our ops careers, I'd love to hear if anyone has some thoughts on what are foundational ops skills or talents that you need to develop, and then what would you call kind of more sophisticated? So just to tee it up, I think the art of managing upwards is something that comes later in your ops career. So I feel like in my own career, it was more about tactically Googling, how do I do HR contracts in Lagos, Nigeria? Really tactical things, versus later on, it became more about how do I influence my peers on the executive team? How do I partner with my CEO and or co-founder, to balance our strengths and skills to grow the business? So I'll just let anyone unmute instead of calling on you if you have any thoughts on building the foundation of your skills. Kelsey.
Yeah, so I can answer from personal experience. I feel like the thing that kind of helped me the most was really focusing in the early days on being an absolute champion doer, like being the person who can get stuff done, and for everyone to kind of see me as the person who can get stuff done. And then once that kind of foundational skill was in place for me, where I was just yeah, I am a person who can get shit done, everything else kind of fell into place. You solve the tactical problem that comes your way, or you figure out how to manage your time to do other stuff on top of that. But yeah, that was just one thing that I had in my mind. When I joined my last company, I joined quite early stage when there were only 5 people. And I remember saying to myself, I'm going to be the best operations person that has ever joined this company, and just framed all of my actions in that kind of intention. And I found that really helpful to be driving my day-to-day actions.
I love that. Go ahead, Marta.
I'll jump in and I could relate to what Kelsey said a lot. And I would also add being open-minded and saying yes, because there's going to be a lot of things, especially early in the career, that you don't know how to do, but you'll figure it out. Because for example, I had we had an event, somebody was going on maternity leave, and then there was an event to organize for 600 people for 3 days. I had never done something like this, but you just say yes, and then you go and figure it out. And and another skill would be learning, knowing people, like people skills, how to talk to people, understand their problems, and like just listening. So if you know people well, you know how to help them better as well. So I think that would be also get to know all the people.
Brooks?
Yeah. Everything so far, I completely agree with, and it's actually one of the things that just even reflecting back on my own career, I think there's this transition that happens where, to Marta's point, within your career, you are just so eager to say yes to everything and take everything on, that you are problem solving, you are the doer, you are viewed as that type of individual internally. And whether it's myself or even just other strategy and operations leaders, I think one of the things that happens is there's this moment in your career where like you can have this inflection point of just like continuing down that path of a doer. And not to mean it in a negative context, there's almost this element of like you just put yourself in a position of constantly being dictated to, almost of like, here is what needs to get done and thus do it, versus I think the best strategy and operations leaders and the folks that I was able to like learn from almost make this transition like overnight, almost, where they're able to now all of a sudden like push back a little bit and like not just be dictated to, but also help in dictating like what needs to get done throughout the organization. And I think it's that transition that takes place into just being operations versus strategy and operations, because now all of a sudden you're the one helping to navigate and almost like push back on the leadership team that's saying, hey, we got to get these things done. It's, well, hey, let's take this into a bigger look at this in a bigger picture and understand we're never going to have a lack of priorities or good ideas, but how do we evaluate like what really needs to get done and move forward? And so everything that folks are saying, I think it's like this career trajectory that folks in strategy and operations have of like, say yes to everything, get us exposed to as much as you possibly can, because now all of a sudden you have the ability and the input of having so much line of sight into different areas that you have a better lens to look at the entirety of the business than frankly anyone else at the organization oftentimes does. So I just wanted to add that because I know that's something I look back and there was like this year or two rut where I just felt like I was just doing maybe more so than in the back of my mind thinking, I'm not really sure we need to be pressing in here as much as we do these other areas.
Great. Before you chime in, Mike, I was just going to say, it's so interesting what Marta said is you can get really far by saying yes, even, to things, even if you don't know how to do them. But I think what Brooks has picked up on is that actually, as you become more strategic, it's actually about deciding what to execute on versus what not to do. So I want to pick up on how to say no, if that's possible. But Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it was essentially that as well, which I was going to build on, is I think Brooks makes kind of a really good point as well, like building on what the others said, is there gets a point in terms of, I suppose, that growth of your career where you want to move from that fixing the problems every day, which I can see was one of the Q&As in the comments as well. And how do you move from that to getting to the next milestone? And like just thinking aloud was some of the tools that I found really helpful in my own career to make that transition, I think, was thinking about like the urgent versus the important, right? Like plotting that on a matrix, what's really urgent, what's important, high and low, really simple, put it out in a quadrant. Like I found that really helpful to start to step back a bit and think about, okay, what's actually really important that we need to focus on? And then another question that I always remember, it's a classic question, but I got asked by our CEO back when we were a much smaller startup, was what's going to break if we're at 10x? And so it's not just kind of, okay, well, like what's breaking now, what needs fixing right now, but it's, okay, we need to think about growing this business 10x. What do we need to change foundationally about our operations in order to execute on that? And so that really allowed me personally to step back for a moment and think, whoa, you're right. This isn't just about fixing the fires right now, but predicting the fires that are going to come when we're 10x in size. And so, yeah, urgent, important, matrix, and what breaks at 10x, not just what's breaking now, I think was two things that I found certainly really helpful in my growth.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, thank you so much for calling out. Great questions from Emily and from Briley. Yeah, I think operations is really challenging because there can be so many holes to fill and so many problems to fix. I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have as operations leaders, to decide what to do or what not to do and when. And as any of my former colleagues who's attending will be able to quote me on this, I always say urgent eats important for breakfast. But then if you don't solve some operational issues, by the time you scale, as Mike's saying, to 10x, it's almost too late, to go back in time. So we'll talk more about kind of how you implement tools and what you recommend for supporting your growth as you scale. But I'd love to go back to this saying no and the art of delegation. So for those of you who have progressed in your ops careers and made that transition from being the executor and the doer and the, I was going to say get shit doneer, and you start building operations teams, what are some lessons that you've learned as you've stopped being more the executor and been more of the operations manager or leader? I don't know if we want to start maybe with Kelsey.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of a good example. I think one big thing is obviously to duplicate yourself, as in to pass over some tasks that you're doing to another competent human in your team. Processes are key. You've got to be able to standardize the way things are done. But then I think one lesson that I learned kind of the hard way was to make sure that you're measuring things right. Because if you I remember there was a process at my last company where we were measuring kind of how effective one of our processes was. And it was like how many users were being onboarded and activated on the platform. And we were just measuring it in completely the wrong way. And so it looked like it was doing terribly. And to be fair, it wasn't doing that well. But we weren't set up properly to really hand that process over to another person, and they got really demoralized and they thought they were doing a terrible job, and of course they could have been doing a better job, but I think from that point onwards I was always really careful to make sure that anything that was handed over to teams was being measured correctly and in the right way. So a bit of a data deep dive is sometimes needed to really understand your metrics and what's going on.
Great, thanks for sharing, Kelsey. Mike?
Yeah, I'll dive in a little bit as well. Like I think one of the things that I found really difficult was, I suppose, going from that like individual contributor thing to more of a people manager thing and building that team and growing it out. And at first, delegating was very, very difficult because I think as operations people, we have such a habit of like getting shit done, right? It's just like, okay, I want to execute, I want to make that happen fast. And it was really difficult at the beginning to think, okay, well, like I can do that faster if I do it myself. But when you start to think like, okay, but if I'm managing a team of at the beginning, like 1, 2, 3, 4 people, and I am able to spend that initial time at the start where it's going to take longer, but then you skill them up, then you've created like 5 of yous, but even better, they've got complementary skill sets that I don't even have anymore. And so one of the things I suppose I would encourage everyone who's managing for the first time or that kind of thing to think about is if what you're delegating isn't uncomfortable, then you're probably not delegating enough. Like I think it should really be quite uncomfortable to give up that control. And if it's comfortable, it's probably not enough that you're delegating. So yeah, really think about that. Delegate to a point of discomfort. And then the way that you manage that is just obviously like really clear one-to-one structures, really empower the employees and people that you're managing and indirectly managing as well. And yeah, there's a whole load of resources out there on one-to-ones and management, but delegation and doing that through discomfort is, I think, the main one that I found tough and I would really encourage people to think about.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. I know I personally struggled with delegation just because I really love the control of like knowing exactly what I put in is what I get out. But it was important for me to realize that a business could not scale if I was doing everything. And so I think one philosophy is like you want to kind of put yourself out of a job. So, if you are the customer service team, like I remember the early days of my fintech, I was the person who on WhatsApp messaging every customer. I needed to hire a customer service team so that I stopped doing that. And then, I needed to stop doing just all of the HR, but actually build a people operations team. So I think, you should kind of put yourself out of business. Oh, sorry, Kelsey.
Yes, I was just going to build on what Mike said there, which is it often gets worse before it gets better. As in, when you first delegate to someone, they won't do it as well as you do it. But it's worth kind of working through that episode or discomfort to help them get back to a stage where you are happy with how they're doing it. Because ultimately that's freeing up your time, and you're never going to scale if you want to hold on to your darlings forever. So there is always discomfort when you first delegate to someone.
I'll add as well as like it's very interesting to listen because like I'm on that verge right now, so I'm like during this panel I'm learning from you as well. And to add to this, like making myself redundant, we've been very careful about writing down processes in our company right now. So everything I do, I want to make sure it's like if I'm not here, somebody else can do it. So it's like making it super clear, and then somebody can take it and make it their own as time goes on.
Love that. Thanks for sharing. I will share one more thing, and then I want to go back to a question that Elisa asked in the chat. So for me, I think of the 3 Ds. So it's delegate, deprioritize, and decline. So I think it's not always, you don't always have the luxury of doing that, but that kind of helps me also sort things, at least from a management. We at Operations Nation joke about operations, which is like the art of figuring out how to manage yourself as an operator. But yeah, so this is a bit more concrete and practical. When your operations role became big enough that you moved from kind of saying yes and being an operator to saying no or being more strategic, what role was your first hire, and what responsibilities did you move off your plate?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to it. And I will say, I think it always is going to be dependent upon the business itself. The thing that I had shared with me early on in my career is as strategy and ops folks, a lot of times we feel momentum within the company. And when momentum is like starting to slow and you got to have that injection, or when there's a hiccup along the way. So in past lives, one of the things that my first hire was like someone on the business operations side. And I know sometimes that'll fall into sales. It can also fall into strategy and operations. Just the structure of our business, it made sense to add it to the operations team. But for us as an organization, we were having a lot of breakdown as it related to understanding how to maximize the value of our product with our go-to-market strategy. And that was just a very tactical role that we needed to really introduce to the organization to continue to allow for that momentum to build on that side. But we were kind of running into that stagnation that was occurring. So that's one role that I've found to be really impactful in past lives and hires.
I can add something. Oh, sorry, Mike. I'll go. Then you go. Yeah. I've always found like so I've seen it happen 2 ways. One, where we just hired kind of smart generalists to do stuff because there was so much to do, and over time defined how the team structure was actually going to work and gave people more specific roles. That's one way I've seen it work. And another way was, if your company raises a funding round and you do have enough cash to be able to kind of design your team from the outset, then you can do that kind of clear thinking piece of which roles you need to be able to deliver on different parts of the operational organization. And then it's just like you're hiring maybe 5, 6, 10 people at once, and it's just who you find first. But I've seen it happen those 2 ways, where you sort of just hire generalists or you hire specific people and sort of build the team based on your architectural plan that you've put together?
Yeah, I would totally agree with what Kelsey said. I think we did a bit of both of that as well. For me, on the operations side, like on operations specifically, that I really needed help in, we hired just really smart generalists, like really hungry graduates that just wanted to get involved, get stuck in, and that was really successful. And those individuals have now grown in the business, and some of still here, some have gone on to be really, really incredible. And they were able to, I suppose, specialize over time to the things that they really loved. And that was really great to see and a great help for me at the time. And then there was on the other side, just really functional stuff. Like a classic example, I think, is customer service. It was that classic situation where, I was on call 24/7, constantly being the one dealing with issues, fires, customers, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, right, we need some structure here. If we want to be able to step out of the weeds in any way, we need somebody that's actually going to be the first point of call for customers. And so, yeah, I know a common first, very functional hire that often falls within operations is a customer service or customer care role as well. That was certainly game changing for us and my time to think, as it were.
Great. Thank you for all of that really, really helpful insight. I think as Brooke said, it really depends on what your type of business is, what stage you're at. I think probably how many customers you've acquired or what your key metrics are, as Kelsey mentioned earlier. If you're thinking like you have certain metrics for the next round of funding, then you should probably focus on that. So like if your investors are going to be looking for like high revenue growth, then you should probably have someone who's focused on biz dev, even if that is just the co-founders. So I think really thinking about the metrics that you need to show and demonstrate, either for your own personal success, or to raise a round if you're VC backed, would be helpful. And then also love the point about generalists versus specialists, and I think that definitely changes as you grow and scale. Okay, so we have only a few more minutes, so apologies to the audience. I may not get to all of your questions, but I definitely want to tackle some of the application questions. So one of our missions at Operations Nation is to share as many resources and kind of aggregate them in a convenient place. So I'd love to hear, if you could go around, and I'd love for everyone to share what resources have really inspired you or helped you to develop professionally during your ops career? So I'd love to just hear if whether it's books or articles or podcasts or communities. I'd just love to hear what's been most helpful for you as you've grown in your career. And I'll cue you so we can go around. Why don't you start with Marta?
So actually, like listening into the podcast, to the conference today as well, some of the people who've been speaking here, I've been listening to their podcasts. So for example, Culture Ops podcast and Aspiring Ops. It's been very, very interesting for me just to listen to other people's thinking and then to see what can I take on board. And definitely, I could not have done my last 2 years without the Ops Stories Slack group as well, as being totally new to the role, and every month something new coming up, and there was always some support there, and somebody had gone through that process, so I didn't have to reinvent the wheel. I had some few steps already. I could get a help from other people, which I thought was very, very good. And I think people-wise as well, I had like a couple of great managers in my first tech company, who taught me more how to work with people and how to inspire them and how to see the possibilities, what they can do. And I think that is also very key, because if you don't have good managers, if you haven't had that role model, I don't think I would know how to what to aspire towards. So I think that has been great as well.
Thanks, Marta. Over to you, Mike.
I love this question. Big fan of resources. I'm taking notes of what everybody says. I think some of the resources that have helped me the most, like big fan of podcasts, books, and people, essentially. So some of the books that I've loved are Radical Candor by Kim Scott. I think if you don't already have a culture of feedback, then be the architect of creating it. That's how I certainly learned a huge amount. It's just getting rapid feedback ASAP on everything that you're doing. And so that's a great book on doing that. High Output Management by Andy Grove was really helpful for me in going from that individual contributor headspace to a management headspace. It's a bit of an old school book, but yeah, really enjoyed that one. Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. I love, great one, especially for managing upwards because it's a constant negotiation. Big fan of that. Patrick Lencioni does a great podcast called At the Table, also author of 5 Dysfunctions of a Team and The Advantage. Really, really enjoy his. And then the last thing I would just say is to echo that, really think about the communities that you're a part of. So Operations Nation, Op Stories has been so helpful for me over the last 5-6 years. No doubt about that. And like, I really believe the notion that you are a product of the 5 people in your life that you spend most of your time with. So sometimes that's just a good thing to, I think, reflect on and think like, who are the 5 people that you spend most of your time with? And do you want to be a product of those people? And maybe you want to like spend more time with someone, invite someone into your circle in order to just learn from them and be around them and pick up on their tips and tricks and habits. So yeah, a bit of a whistle-stop tour there, but yeah, some books and podcasts and think about the people.
Amazing. Thanks, Mike. Kelsey.
Yeah, I think a lot of operations and being good at building operations at a company comes down to people skills. So I mean, there's no one single source to kind of develop that. It's all the things that have been mentioned so far. It's managers, surrounding yourself with great people, podcasts, books, etc. But I do have 2 specific things that 2 resources that I'd love to share. One I found really useful in the early days for kind of understanding operations, and I'm going to drop it into the chat. You've probably already watched it, but it's a Stanford lecture on like what is operations, and I found that really, really useful. There's also a transcript if you would prefer to read that. And then the other resource I'll share is a book, also very famous, Nonviolent Communication. I took so much away from that book about being able to interact, communicate, speak to people and get the best from them without them defending. And it's actually not about violence at all. It's about how if what you say is received defensively by the other party, you've lost the ability to connect. So you're just fighting a losing battle. And I really, really love that book.
Thanks so much, Kelsey. And Brooks.
Yeah, I love a lot of the references, podcast, books that have already been mentioned. I think the Never Split the Difference, one that Mike had brought up, was one I really enjoyed. And it's not really, the second one here is not a strategy and operations specific book, but I think when I read this, it was early stage of kind of forming my opinion and shaping how I wanted to go about strategy and operations, but reading the hard things about hard things. Coming from the perspective of a CEO, one of the things that I think I took for granted was being able to just kind of get in the mind of a CEO, of probably a visionary who's going to be wired quite a bit differently than a strategy and operations leader, and understanding how to form that connection to taking that long-term vision and helping to like communicate it in a tactical, execution-oriented way across the business. I think that was just something I took for granted early on in my career. And then another book I love is Working Backwards by Colin Breyer, who was the former chief of staff of Jeff Bezos. I think, again, just getting into or being able to hear different perspectives of how folks have gone about working alongside a visionary in the company, and then figuring out how do we translate this into like building. I think a strategy and operations leader is one of the things it seems like we all have a passion for, is like helping to build and helping to play an integral role in that. So understanding the human side of it and how to put the right people in the right positions has just been really, I think, something that's helped me. But to everyone's point here, it is about getting as many connections and frankly, just asking questions of other strategy and ops leaders that I think has been really awesome for me in my career.
Wonderful. Well, I'm afraid we are out of time, but I have to honor at least one of the rapid fire questions, as the three of us are very inspired by Brene Brown, who doesn't focus on operations, but is just incredible and gives incredible talks on leadership. So just round the table, what is one thing you're deeply grateful for right now, seeing as those of us who celebrate Thanksgiving just celebrated and we're going into the holiday season. So we'll go Brooks first, and then Kelsey, then Mike, then Marta.
Sure. Yeah, it's we are, for those that aren't aware, Late is a startup, like the truest sense of the word. So we are in the like constant grind and push towards building something special here. And frankly, the only way you're able to do that is if you've got great family and a support network around you. And so coming out off the heels of Thanksgiving last week here in the States, that is something that I'm incredibly grateful for, because it is at any growth stage or high growth company, it is about surrounding yourself with a support system.
Great. Kelsey.
Yeah. I mean, not to be boring, but I also am incredibly grateful for the Marvel team that I have around me. Obviously couldn't do my job without them, but also I think so much of like what I love about operations is about the people that I work with. And I'm grateful that we're able to gather. I'm grateful for remote working too, and Wi-Fi and all of the rest of it. But I'm grateful for being able to gather in person with my team.
Yeah, man, I just echo both of those so much. Like the ability to eat together in the office and gather is just so great. But if I had to pick something specific for me right now, I think I'm most grateful for health. I think just after the last few years, I think it's something which is so easy to take for granted when we are healthy. And I suppose there's just been a lot of reminders recently how important that is. It allows me to like think, it allows me to stay engaged, it allows me to throw myself in. And so, yeah, make sure to always look after yourself physically and mentally as well, because health is just so important.
And I'm with Brooks, family and friends around, and just whenever you need support, you having people always to who you can turn to, and they're there for you. So I'm very grateful for that.
Amen. Well, on that note, on behalf of the whole Operations Nations team, we are so thankful for you four, our phenomenal panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your journeys with humor and vulnerability. I'm really excited to see where your career paths take you next, wherever you are in your stage.